I've been wanting to do a video on the Acura RDX forever, and I'm so glad I finally got it during the best time of the year. So strap yourself in and enjoy. Now that you've seen the exterior of the RDX, I think you have a pretty good understanding of what they're going for here. This is one of the better Acura designs to come out in a long time, and that's going to be a repetitive pattern in this video. The interior is a carryover, much of the same. This is their next generation style that's going to be in the future MDX and pretty much everything else. And you can see where they've borrowed design elements from the new NSX, from the controls, the center stack, the switches, and some of the materials. Now what they're trying to do here, and this is straight from their PR, which you can take that with a grain of salt usually, they're trying to use authentic materials instead of just saying we're using wood and alloys, and it works extremely well for the price point. And I said this to many people that get in here, it has a big wow factor. And this is where they have to take things to the next level now, because there's so much competition. If they don't just suck you in the first time you sit in a car, you almost just blow it off. And you can see that with older designs. You might just take this over something that might be better underneath, but the interior is just such a great place. All right, let's talk about ergonomics, something that Honda and Acura have had a good history of, and it continues here. Your windows, your switches, all your buttons for your HUD are physical, your lane keep assist, your parking sensors are all here. Your steering wheel controls, I mean, at first glance, there's a lot here, but all your main functions for your gauge cluster, to control it, your volume, there's no touch sensitive crap here, it just all works. The other thing I like, your steering wheel heater button is right here. You don't have to search the center stack for it. And then when you move over to the center stack, it has this kind of flowing design. And I feel like, in a way, it looks cool, but it's not the best use of space, because what it does is it creates this cavern underneath to store stuff that you can't really get to, you have to fumble for, and it tends to fly around. There's no wireless charging pad down here. Your USB ports are horrendous to get to. And I mean, this is the sacrifice. You kind of take this cool looking thing here, and then you don't have the functionality. It sacrifices like cup holder space and just kind of space in general to make use of this massive dynamic control mode, which is just the switch drive modes. It's the biggest part. And then your park, your reverse, your neutral, and drive selector are all push button, which honestly, if you're going to do a digital shifter, this is the best way to do it. It's the least confusing once you remember where everything's at. And then you get to your touchpad interface, which I'll get to when we get to the infotainment. Your sliding center space here is good because your armrest moves forward and back, which a lot of cars are fixed, so you can get more comfortable in here. If you get closer to the steering wheel, at least you can move your armrest with you. Everything is padded perfectly in here for your knees, your arms. It just feels like a great high-quality space. Now I'm going to roll up the window to give you a sense of isolation so I can talk about one of the most important things about this vehicle that I hear over and over again. The ELS 3D audio system. And typically with audio systems, you know, they all claim to be great. This is a bit different. I'm going to give you the history about it because I don't hear this story told. Back in the early 2000s, a producer by the name of Elliot he's won multiple Grammys. You don't really need to know what he won for. So he had this idea to create this studio type environment in a car, or create a DSP or a surround system. And he approached all these different vendors that did different types of car audio, and basically everybody told him they weren't interested or they didn't do that. And eventually Panasonic got back to him and said, look, we're interested in what you're talking about and we want to build a 3D audio system. So Panasonic had a contract with Acura back in the early days, and they did the first ELS audio system in the TL. And what he wanted to do was take what he did in the studio with the studio monitors all calibrated and have the same type of, or the closest type of experience you can have in a car, so his artists could listen to it in an Acura, and that was his goal. So fast forward all these years, he's still working with Panasonic, who does the audio in this system, and now they have a 3D version of this, and all that means is it has surround sound, more acoustic treatments, because you have ceiling-mounted speakers now, which almost is like the Atmos copy, which is made by Dolby, and they want to make this one of the best in the price range and most accurate sound reproduction. Now, you don't have a CD or a DVD player to have like DVD audio in here anymore. The only way you can really get the best quality is to use like USB files or USB non-compressed audio, which I've tested. And I feel like this is definitely the best sounding system you can get pretty much until you get into like the Bowers and Wilkins in the upper end Volvos. All right. Now that you know more than you want about the audio setup, let's talk about the rest of the interior space. The HVAC controls, heating and cooling, is all physical. You don't have to use the infotainment for any of it. You have a physical volume knob, track selector, and everything else is on the steering wheel. The only negative part is if you have your seat farther back, I can see you having difficulty adjusting some of this stuff. Seating-wise, speaking of that, the seat adjustability is great. You have an extendable thigh cushion that's electronic. Your bolsters can get really tight and hug you in place, and it kind of assists you on the screen to tell you some of the functions on the side of the seat. And I've never been in a place with this car where I felt uncomfortable. The seating design is great, and then of course you have memory seats to lock it in because the adjustments are pretty finicky. I would say, other than that, the biggest part to talk about is the infotainment setup, but I'm going to head in the shop to do that so I can give you a deeper overview of it. I've just teleported into the shop to talk about the new Acura Infotainment, or MMI, whatever you like to call it. This is built upon Android 5.1.1. And what is that? Well, it's the same thing that you use on your new Samsung or Google device or LG or whatever you use. But here, it's 4 versions behind. Now, you're going to be wondering, okay, it's already out of date. Here we go again. Well, Honda and Acura have finally started to implement over-the-air updates, which means you can get updates wirelessly on here to patch bugs, to add features and all that, so you're not stuck with the same thing 3 years from now when something doesn't work. You can still take it into the dealership or update it over USB, but it is nice to have the over-the-air function. Now, let's get into the usability, because this is some concerns people have. When you look at this, you see a mouse pad. And anybody that's ever used a laptop, you're going to be like, oh, okay, I can kind of get that. Until you start using it and you realize it doesn't work like a mouse pad, because what they're doing is they're trying to keep it from you looking down here or having a cursor. So the way it works is if you have an icon on the top left, you move your finger to the top left of the pad and you kind of feel that corner. If there's an application on the top right, you move your finger to the top right and click on it. That way you're kind of just moving your finger on the pad to where you want to move it on the screen. It's almost a one-to-one. And it makes it a lot more simple when you're using it in park. And I think the biggest complaint people are going to have is they're used to seeing a cursor like a real mouse, which you don't have here, even though it really is a mouse and it's baked into the software. Now, there's a hidden menu that I found here where you can get into a dev screen, which is the developers that worked on it, and you can see the cursor. You can see that it is still functioning like a mouse, even though they hide it, and they have a different way to use it. And you can see in the screen also, like, if you figure out how to get in here and click on it, you can see quotes from the different developers that have worked on it. And of course, some of them have left after this project, go figure, and some of them are still there, and somebody obviously is a Princess Bride fan because there's a quote from the Princess Bride in there as well. Now, once you get used to this, I think the best way to do it is getting rid of all the icons on your home screen. Just get rid of all of them and then just add a couple back. And I talked to my Honda Acura rep, Jessica, about this, and she said that's the best way to do it because then you're not littered with all these screens. You have multiple panels that you have to swipe through. For me, I just leave it simple. Bluetooth audio, settings, and USB audio. That's all I care about on here. The negative part about that is you can kind of customize it, but it doesn't let you make shortcuts for core functions other than applications. Like if I want to turn the screen off, there's no physical button for it, and I have to menu jump. And I go into settings, and then I have to go into display, and then I have to move my finger over to display off, and I can't long press that to put that on the home screen or set a shortcut where it's a one-touch thing. And I think this is subject to so many of the same problems that other infotainment has because of that. Now, the best part is if you look at this bezel, where all the physical controls are, there's plenty of space to add buttons that they probably need to add, like display off, or the best thing this car needs is a source button on the center stack. That way you never have to go into the menu to switch between sources. This is something that's been around since forever that they really need to add back. There's no reason not to have it. But I feel like there's enough space, there's enough design flexibility in here for Acura and Honda to improve this enough where it's going to mitigate some of the complaints of this car over time, but not all of it. And there's going to be a learning curve. If you're not tech savvy, this is something you're going to have to look at for sure and work with your dealership to figure it out before you buy it. This might make you walk away from the car, and I've heard people say that. Now, there's some other great things about this interior space, and that is their integration of the electronics and the use of the HUD. You can set this up where if I turn off the screen at night and I don't want to be blinded, when I adjust the volume, guess what? It doesn't turn that big screen on to tell me the volume. It will show it to me in the HUD what the volume is, and then it goes away. So I'm not distracted by all this bright instrumentation. And there's a lot of smart tweaks that they do, namely in the center screen. It tells you basically all of what you need, and you can kind of get rid of it and put it in minimal mode, so you're not distracted by too much information. And that's something that I feel is becoming more and more of a problem in cars. If you're working all day, you're sitting in front of a screen all day, I hate getting in a car that you're bombarded with all of this stuff. I don't need any more information. I just want to enjoy the drive. And they do a really good job at keeping distractions to a minimum. You've made it to the underbody segment with the Acura RDX on the bend pack lift. And there's so much to cover, I'm just going to get right into it. This is a brand new architecture for Acura, and it's not going to be the last time they use it either. They've made so many improvements to the entire body structure. I'm going to detail those now. First, if you get the advanced package vehicle, you get true adaptive dampers. Struts in the front, shocks in the rear. And what is it? Well, it's tied into the vehicle dynamic systems, like the drive mode, steering angle sensors, G-force sensors, speed, all of that. And it is constantly adjusting the rebound and compression of the shocks. It is infinitely adjusting it as fast as possible. All the other trim levels just get traditional electronic dampers that are kind of tied to drive mode settings, like your comfort mode, your sport mode, and it will adjust rebound and compression based on those, but this is truly tied into the entire body. The next thing you're going to notice is all the underbody panels. They're trying to reduce wind turbulence, they're trying to reduce drag. They have air curtains in the front like many cars do, but they still haven't gone off the deep end. These panels are super easy to remove to get to the drain plug for the trans, and all the serviceable items. The next thing you're going to notice, this has an aluminum lower control arm that is tied into a hydraulic bushing that attaches this to the subframe. And this hydraulic bushing is meant to reduce a lot of vibration from the road and also still kind of give you some feel when you're driving. The other part is they use a variable gear ratio electronic power steering rack with the electric motor mounted on the rack, not in the column. So this gives you, I don't know, it does feel pretty natural overall. They're taking what your inputs are, the torque from the steering wheel, and trying to transfer as much of that to the wheels and then back to you without feeling synthetic. And I feel like it does a pretty good job. The steering is a highlight in here, and it goes to show you if you program all of this stuff right, it can give you great rewards driving it. Now, the rest of the underbody here really is what you typically see. You have a steel knuckle in the front, which you can see is already totally starting to have surface rust on it. But other than that, this is typical stuff you see on most modern cars. Now I'm looking at the rump of the RDX. And before I get to all of this, the body structure. It's way more rigid than the previous generation, which is something every manufacturer does. They have to improve it. But they've done a few things that are a first for them. Namely, they started using structural adhesives, something we've seen the Koreans doing on most of their cars. They're using over 110 feet of structural adhesive, which helps to increase rigidity, lose weight, and then quiet the body down. They're using a whole bunch of other tricks with high-strength steel, and they're injecting foam in over 12 different cavities of this body to also reduce noise and NVH. So that's new. Now, onto the suspension. You have a multi-link rear end, and I count 5 specific connections here. You have a coil spring and a separated damper, which I've already talked about. Your knuckle in the back is aluminum, unlike the front, but everything else is stamped steel, including the subframe carrier. Now, the big thing to talk about, well, look, it has real exhaust tips. Nothing fake about this. And you have a TVD, a torque vectoring differential, which is why they call this SH all-wheel drive. And all that means is, really, you do have a torque vectoring differential. So what this is capable of doing is sending 70% of the torque to the rear. So if you have traction and stability control off, you can literally get this thing sideways. The second thing with a torque vectoring differential is it's not just an on and off switch. It can literally transfer 100% of torque to one wheel or the other, because the way that this works is it has 2 clutches in it that can send power either way. And that's what makes this a lot more dynamic to drive. And it's something that you can't really talk about while you're driving. It's something you have to feel. So when you turn that wheel over and it's starting to break traction on one side, this can transfer power to one side or the other to balance out the car. And it's not like a typical all-wheel drive feeling. It is a lot more dynamic. It feels more rear-wheel drive bias when you're driving it. Just a lot more, you feel a lot more rotation because of this. And that's why this is definitely one of the better all-wheel drive systems. I also drove it in their Ridgeline, which that also has a TVD. But that's one of the highlights why you would buy the RDX over systems that are just generic on demand, that's just clutch-based or electromagnetic clutches. But that's enough of the underbody segment. Let's take a look under the hood. Under the hood of the RDX, finally, and I'm gonna blow over some of this. This is a K20 C4. A variation of the Accord 2-liter turbo and the Civic Type R turbo. So it shares so many of the same technologies. A smaller turbo that builds so much torque right away at about 1,500 RPMs, and it goes flat to about 4,500 RPMs. Now, this makes power almost like a naturally aspirated car. You can almost not tell that it has a turbo on it. It's because it's so small. It revs all the way cleanly to 6,800 RPMs, and that's one of the best parts about this. It has a standalone intercooler, which is in the front part of the bumper for cooling, and a lot of this is for efficiency packaging. So they use smaller spark plugs now. You have an integrated exhaust manifold built into the head with an integrated water jacket as well to help with cooling the exhaust gases. You have VTEC on the exhaust side only because you have a turbo blowing hot air, cooled air into the motor. You know, 0W20 still, I mean, it's about efficiency and about power, and that's what Honda's always tried to do, and Acura. They give you the performance that you're looking for and still trying to give you the lower emissions and fuel economy. It's just a lot more complicated than it used to be. But again, enough of talk. Let's get on the road and drive this thing. Setting off in the RDX. I've waited for almost a year to drive this. I feel like I'm the last person on the planet to do so. But I gotta tell you, this is probably the best Acura product I've been in since around the 2005 TL. It has everything that you remember from some of the older Acura and Honda products. The good steering feel, the stiffness without being disgustingly firm. The fun to drive aspect is here. And I think the biggest part is it feels kind of special on the interior. And I said this on the interior part of it, it does have a wow factor. It feels youthful, it feels original without being overdone. You know, there's that element to a lot of newer cars. They have to go off the deep end to try to impress people and wow people, and they do it creatively in terms of the driving experience, where almost every single function of this car works well. All right, let's get into what that means. All right, when you come into a corner, there's this level of confidence that this RDX gives you. I mean, it feels like you could literally throw this around like a sports sedan. And even in comfort mode, there's 3 different driving modes: Comfort, Sport, and Sport Plus. The dampers never go overly firm, even in Sport Plus. So you can drive it in any mode and still feel good. Like, it's good over most pavement types, even bad stuff, which is getting to be increasingly difficult to find in cars where you hit bad pavement, and with the adaptive suspension, it feels like it's always way too firm. Not on the RDX. You're going to enjoy the driving composure, the quietness in this, and then the ability to, I'm not kidding, you could throw this thing around and drive it hard, and it doesn't feel like it's going to roll over on itself. So I'm going to flip this over to Sport, and I'm going to start to go through some turns here. Go down in the 3rd gear. The transmission, let's talk about that. The transmission performance, it's got some pros and cons. The upshifting is really fast, like very, very good. You're never going to notice any issues pretty much daily driving, or when you drop the hammer. It's only when you start to kind of go half throttle and like these in-between throttle movements that you feel like there's way too much gear hunting. Sometimes it doesn't feel like the right gear is always queued up, and I think that's one of the biggest annoyances of it. I just think this has too many gears, and you notice it more the more you drive it. And let's just nail this off the line. I'm going to put this in Sport Plus, just normal, just leaving the traction control on, and let's take off. Now, you hear all that shifting, and it makes it feel like it's so much faster than it is, and that's also the benefit of having more gears. I think it does 3 gear changes before you get to 60. And, you know, I gotta say, I don't mind it at all. The way that this engine revs out makes it feel more naturally aspirated. This is where it impresses you the most. The engine performance. There's virtually no turbo lag. It feels like a last generation Honda or Acura with a smaller V6. This is probably one of my favorite engine and turbo combinations I've been in. I just got out of the CX5, and you can see they're doing something totally different with their car. They're trying to give you all this torque, almost diesel levels of torque, and then it falls flat on its face when it revs out. This car just builds the power, and it's smooth all the way to the red line, and those shifts happen extremely fast to upshift, and it's such a joy to drive this car. And if you're just focused on the driving experience, it's one of the best CUVs you're going to get into. Now, the negative parts are there. This has the transmission programming for manual control is not good. When you get into Sport Plus, it just kind of like hangs the revs randomly. The only way to take full manual control with the transmission via the paddles is to put the transmission to sport mode, and then it kind of will stick in manual mode, but it always auto upshifts. Your downshifts are not rev matched at all, and it just feels totally clunky. And I'm just going to give you a demo here to show you what that's like. So kind of here's the highlights. This is definitely, again, one of the best 4-cylinder turbo implementations in terms of tuning. It feels great. The suspension is set up properly in Comfort and in Sport Plus. It always gives you an element of stability and control. The steering feels good and is not overly stiff when you go into Sport Plus. It feels natural. And in terms of the brakes, they don't have them set up where they're overly boosted. And when I say that, a lot of these CUVs are going to this feather touch, instantaneous slam your head on the steering wheel brake setups. And this, you have to get into the pedal a little bit more. And I think it's partly the brake pad compound they've chosen. It needs a little bit more heat to start getting grabby. So in the cold, you do have to get in the pedal more, but as soon as you do, it stops. And I like that. It doesn't feel very synthetic. And that's what I'm getting at. This is one of the most natural, most enjoyable driving Acuras in a long time. Let's get to the final thoughts. Final thoughts on the new RDX. And when I say new, I mean it. This was built from the ground up to be an Acura exclusive architecture for their CUV products. It is not some reskinned Honda Civic or CRV like many other companies do. So why would they spend all this time and money to have something like this? Well, the reality is this is one of the most competitive segments. CUVs and SUVs are where most consumers are spending their money. And to get ahead, you kind of have to start from scratch, and that's what they did. They have new things they've never done before, like the way that they do some of their steel stampings, structural adhesives, a newly designed rear independent suspension. I mean, I could go on and on about this stuff, but none of it matters if it doesn't drive well. Here's the 3 key things that they're doing, one of the main reasons why you would buy this over other manufacturers. The first is its overall performance. It's a front-wheel drive platform with all-wheel drive. It feels more like a rear-wheel drive platform because of the way they have the torque vectoring differential tuned. It is so fun to whip around. It is one of the least understeer prone vehicles you're going to get into for a CUV. Combining that with the ride quality and the engine performance, this is also one of the best tuned 2-liter turbos or 4-cylinder turbos I've been in. It is fun to drive from the minute you get on the accelerator all the way to the red line. There's no feeling like there's power inconsistency. Granted, it was colder when I drove it. It's just a lot of fun to operate, and without sacrificing a lot in the ride quality department. The second reason you would buy this is the audio system, the ELS 3D. And it's not the best thing out there, but it's certainly far superior than a lot of companies in this price range. You have to step up almost $20,000 more to get an audio system that is this satisfying to experience. On to the negatives, and truthfully, there's so few, it's just a testament to how good the RDX is. So let's get started. The 10-speed automatic transmission. There's too much gear hunting, and big surprise, why do you really need 10 speeds when you essentially stay under 85 miles an hour the whole car's life? But this is what they're doing. I understand it's for efficiency. But what they can fix is some of the weirdness in upshifting. I felt gear shocks a lot between second and third gear. I mean, it wasn't that big of a deal. The bigger deal was you're selling dynamic performance or this great driving experience. And then when you use the paddles, this car does not rev match downshift at all. It always feels like it hesitates to downshift, and it really sours the experience if you're more into driving. So that's something that could be fixed with logic. Hopefully they can do it. Now, if that doesn't bother you, let's get into the electronics or infotainment. And I told Honda directly, in 10 years, we're going to be reviewing cars like their mobile electronics or laptops or whatever. And part of this is because manufacturers are shooting themselves in the foot by making it the forefront of so much marketing buzz. They're always trying to sell the electronics. And if it's not done right, well, you're going to get bit. And I would say that this is a mixed bag. Acura did spend a lot of time on designing their infotainment. They have a university study on distracted driving behind it. They have a ton of focus groups. But here it is. It's a forked version of Android, which means they get a base OS from Google, they bring it internally, and their developers hack it up for their car. The problem is it's 4 versions back, like I said. And Google's already working on an Android automotive version specifically for cars. And you don't know if you're going to get that in this vehicle or not down the road. Now, they did tell me that there's a ton of hardware overhead on the infotainment, so they can do plenty of over-the-air updates if needed.
which is great. That's a counterpoint. The fact that they can patch and update this over the air is a huge pro for it. But the biggest negative is their absolute position touchpad. It's the only way you can interact with the screen because there's no touch screen, there's no physical controller, which means you are reliant on using that touchpad interface. And I'm going to tell you the main problem with that is from about 5 years old, kids are now put laptops in front of them, Chromebooks, whatever. And what do you learn? That a touchpad, by feel and by look, is to be used with a cursor. And after a couple years, it's baked in here. After 25 years, by the time you're ready to afford an RDX, or 30 years, it's muscle memory. Every single person that gets into this car touches that pad, that touchpad, like it's a mouse, because that's what we've used for so long. And Acura decided this was the best interface to change something that people have used for so long. And it just doesn't work like that. We're too tied into a specific function. Now, it's not that we can't adopt it. It's very simple, like they say. You use the mouse pad or touchpad like it's a touch screen. And that makes sense when you use it. But what doesn't make sense is when you leave that Acura and you go back to the office and you have to use your standardized mouse pad with a cursor. It's just going back and forth as a headache. And I've dealt with this in 20 years of user experience, customizing images and packages for people that just cannot accept change. And that's the way people are, I'm telling you. So the best solution is to add a system option to enable show cursor, so people can still use the absolute positioning, but show them where they're at on the screen. It will make that instant connection. Despite it being just a little bit different, they'll still be able to use it like they've always have since they were kids. So if that doesn't bother you, turn off the screen and just enjoy the drive, because this thing has so many good things going for it. Thanks for watching. I'll talk to you next time.
This Savagegeese, I hate him, I hate him. I'm gonna show you how to get back at him on Yelp and all that other stuff.